Chapter 23, World War I, Section 3, Americans in World War I. Americans joined the fighting in Europe in 1917 as a force separate from the other Allied units. The United States did not want to fight with the French, they didn't want to fight with the British, they wanted to fight separately just as an American unit. And those troops were led by a guy named John J. Pershing, who we talked about in the last chapter when he went chasing after Pancho Villa. But he is in charge of the group of U.S. troops that became known as the American Expeditionary Force. Before we continue, I had to go backward a little bit in time and in history to Russia, where Russia was ruled by a series of kings and queens called czars. And throughout much of Russian history, the czars were from one family called the Romanovs. Some of them were good, like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And then you have some lousy ones like Ivan the Terrible. Toward the end of the czarist period in Russian history, you had a series of czars who were not very good, and a lot of them were assassinated. The last czar of Russia was a guy named Nicholas II, who you see right here in this picture. And his father was assassinated. That's how he became the czar. Nicholas II is his name. Anyway, lots of bad things were going on under Nicholas II. The economy was not good in Russia. People were going on strike. People were protesting. And with World War I, Russians had lost millions of soldiers and civilians during the course of the war. And so people were just fed up with Nicholas II. They're fed up with the czars because the country wasn't doing anything with the czars. They had lost the war a few years earlier to the Japanese, so things were just not good for the Russians in this period. So a Russian Revolution will take place in November of 1917, and this was led by a Russian group known as the Bolsheviks, who were communist, and they overthrew the Russian government of Tsar Nicholas II. Now what they do is they take Nicholas II and his family, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, and they send them off to Siberia. And eventually, down the line, the Tsar and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks. Again, the Bolsheviks were communists. Communists are people who favor equal distribution of wealth and the end of all forms of private property. So they're all about government in control of every aspect of life. And the leader of the Bolsheviks eventually will be this man right here, who is Vladimir Lenin. The new Russian government was led by Vladimir Lenin, as you see here in the picture. He knew that the war had reached a desperate point. 8 million Russians had already been killed, and that's a combination of soldiers and civilians in the country. Soldiers who were in the Russian army were deserting. Food riots were raging in cities because they were starving to death. In March 1918, Russia is going to sign a treaty with Germany called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and that basically took them out of World War I. So Russia is out, and that's one less ally involved in World War I. Now, with Russia out of the war, Germany now can focus all their attention on the Western Front, which is France. They don't have to have their troops divided up between the East and the West. So Germany planned to smash the stalemate by invading France with the second part of their army, and that was thwarted by the Americans, who had just entered the war. Germans made an advance. They made it all the way back to the Marne River, which is right outside Paris, but they were unprepared for the fresh, well-trained American forces had just arrived, and the Germans were driven back. In July of 1918, the German forces are launching their final offensive. They figured this is an all-go-for-all, broke kind of situation here. They attempted to cross the Marne one last time, but they suffered terrible losses, and that forced them to stop their offensive, and they retreated back they started going all the way back to Germany. The Allies drove toward victory after that failed German advance. More than 1 million United States troops were in France. That's what helped swing the tide of war toward the Allies. And the Allies started to win more and more victories against the German forces. Eventually, Germany will be forced back into their own country. Here are some key battles. You have the Battle of Belleau Woods. That essentially drove Germans away from Paris, so Paris is now safe from Germany. The Battle of Argonne Forest. One significant United States soldier in this battle was Alvin York. He single-handedly killed 25 gunners and captured 132 prisoners by himself. And so he was a decorated war hero for the United States. The Harlem Hellfighters, which was the 369th Infantry, were an African-American unit that fought with the French. Now, they weren't allowed to fight with the white soldiers, and really the American soldiers didn't want to fight with the French, but the African-American unit, the Harlem Hellfighters, fought alongside the French and saw more fighting than any American unit in World War I. They were considered heroes by the French, and they actually threw them like a big parade to honor them in France because of that, their bravery in fighting alongside the French. A new strategy was employed, convoy systems that were meant to protect merchant ships from U-boats. A convoy system when you have a whole bunch of ships who are sailing together for protection. By November of 1918, American soldiers were making a rapid advance toward Germany. So Germans were pretty much done by this point. In Germany, at home and in the battlefield, the Germans were just tired of war. I mean, it's been 4 long years, and they've lost millions of people. So there was lots of food shortages, lots of riots and strikes, and of course, because of all the soldiers who were being killed in war, there was a shortage of soldiers. Germany's allies, meaning Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Turks, were also eager to end this war. Austria-Hungary reached a peace accord with the Allies on November 3rd, 1918. That pulled them out of the war. And seeing that his country was beaten, Kaiser Wilhelm II will flee Germany and go somewhere else. When he flees, Germany basically agrees to an armistice, which is a truce or ceasefire, on November 11th, 1918. November 11th, 1918 becomes Veterans Day later on in the United States, because the treaty or the armistice was signed on the 11th day of the 11th hour, or the 11th month, the 11th day, the 11th hour. That is the end of Section 3.